How many of you weren't here last week? Raise your hand because Miss Angela is going to pass out our outline from last week. I only made 4 or 5 because I really didn't think we would have more than 4 or 5 new folks. So just if you're... Okay, so I got 2. Here, Angela, here's the other couple that I have. I have 2 more. I have 2 more. If you weren't here last week. Well, what we've decided to do is spend a couple of weeks just talking about current events and how these current events that we see have some historical background, but they also then give us some food for thought as to what we ought to be doing, how we ought to be living, what the church's response and Christians' response should be to the current events in which we live. And our current events are changing, but I don't know how we should respond has ever changed. Our response to the world in which we live should remain the same, which is to have a very biblical view of the world in which we live and what God's mission for us is to be. We looked last week at some historical things that slowly happened in our country in which power was centralized within the federal government, and it seems like all of the centralization and power acquisition happened during times of great crisis in our country. And as the crisis happened, greater and greater power was pulled into the central government, who then began to dispense what we felt as citizens we needed to remain safe, to take care of our retirements, to take care of our health care, to take care of our education system. We began to ask and have an expectation that would come from the federal level. Well, none of that was wrong in and of itself. That's what was happening. We became very centralized in our government. But at the same time, moral decay also started happening in our country with the events of Darwinism, Freud, the God is dead movement, the complete redefining of morality of the 1960s, and the exposure to alternative world religions and alternative consciousnesses all happened in the 60s. We had one other great thing that happened. Not only was there then the complete dismantling of morality, the dismantling of a God who was the focus of where that moral, ethical, and standard of truth would come from. And so there was the redefining of morality, and the only thing then that would be tolerated, was a tolerance to all of that. A tolerance of immorality, a tolerance of the idea that there is no absolute truth. That would be the only thing we would tolerate, because anyone who said there was absolute truth would not be tolerated. We looked at the redefining of what tolerant. Do you have one more? What the redefining of tolerance looked like, and because of those things, the decay of morality, the redefining of what morality was, the complete abandonment of a standard of truth, we can no longer self-govern, because we don't have a standard from which to govern any longer. There is no right and wrong. There is no truth to be known, and only people who claim to know the truth only think they know the truth. They've just not been enlightened well enough to understand that there really is no absolute truth. And it's really absolute truth that really allows us to self-govern. So if we can't self-govern, then the idea was then the only alternative we have was to be governed, and the only governed was a quickly developing central government that could then govern us. And we've been given ourselves to that for many years. What has happened is that there has been a small chasm between those who feel like the government should do more and the group that says the government should do less. That became a conservative, liberal argument. Because if it's the government that's going to govern us, how much government really became the dividing line between the conservative and the liberal. What we discovered last week through a video by a man named Dennis Prager is that the idea of the conservative and liberal is no longer on the table because liberalism has been taken over and they didn't even realize it was coming. And you saw it this week when a liberal mayor from Minnesota was booed off the stage because he wasn't a socialist. You saw the news? Did anybody see the news? They want to abolish the police. He said, I'm not in favor of it. They swore him, cursed him off the stage, and embarrassed him through the crowd. A liberal man, but not a socialist, because the socialists have now gotten control of that city and many big cities in the United States of America. And if you watch the Dennis Prager with us, or if you go to our website, you can see the video of how liberalism has been ambushed by socialism, and they didn't even know it. And they've changed terminologies on us. We think we're talking the same language when they use certain words like justice. You know what we hear when we hear justice? Those men who perpetrated that crime should be held accountable, processed through the law, and if found guilty, punished to the level that the law will allow. We think that when we hear justice. That's not what the socialists think when they hear the word justice. And we'll talk about that in a minute in a video because our terminology has been changed around. Sad thing is that in a May 2020 survey that was done amongst millennialists, that's your kids and your grandkids, a survey that was done last month amongst millennials find that 70% of millennials are more likely or extremely likely to vote for a socialist. And you're like, how in the world did that happen? What has happened to my country? If my kids and grandkids want to have it look like Greece or Venezuela, what happened along the way? Well, what happened, we talked a little bit about last week. What happened is in the Depression, they got the senior citizens, and they told them, give us your money and we'll take care of you for life. We'll make sure you have medical and you have Social Security, and you will make sure you get taken care of. In other revolutionary types of things, they started with the children, not in the United States. We started with the senior citizens. Then we got the college kids, and now we've got the elementary school level. And the elementary school now, and Angela can tell you the crazy things that's happening, and I'm reading a lot about what's happening at the elementary school level across the United States of America. The elementary school will now be the thing that the government uses to dispense their social agenda. That's why they're willing to feed kids now 7 days a week, 2 to 3 meals a day for life. Why? Because they want a bunch of kids to come out and believe that the government is supposed to take care of these things. So you gave your kids away when they were in grade school in the 60s for sex education. That was a big deal because that was one of the really first moral things that the school said, we'll do a better job than you. We'll educate your kids in that area of morality. And we know that as soon as that happened, immorality went crazy as soon as they had allowed that. We're feeding kids. We have school nurseries now in many schools around the country. You have nurseries so that kids, girls who have been, are now with children in the grade school level can come to school and get their education, but have somebody take care of the babies for them while they're in school. We have health clinics on campus. Many of those health clinics work with local community health clinics so that if a girl needs health care, even an abortion, that's available to her in many of the big cities around the United States. really, you could have even in this school district gotten food at any time you wanted, whether you have kids in the school district or not, simply by driving to some of the schools and telling them that you needed food, and the schools would have provided you meals here in our county. There is a rising expectation amongst children, and this is how we got to the point where 70% of them would vote for a socialist. We've raised a group of children who have the idea that it's the government's role to take care of them. Free education, free health care, certain rights are supposed to be given to you. How in the world did we get here? Well, the church has made a contribution to this. The church, not necessarily Spicewood Baptist or evangelical Christianity, conservative evangelical Christianity, but very much liberal, broad-based religious organizations under the umbrella of the church have contributed to this. And at any point you want to ask questions, I'm going to try to only spend about 5 more minutes on this and then watch a video. The church got involved in this back in the 1950s as Marxism was sweeping the globe. But most of Marxism on the other side of our oceans involved atheistic Marxism, and they would trample out religion as the opium of the masses, destroy the religious institutions, and then set up their Marxist ideologies, which was to take from the haves and give to the have-nots. That was the main gist of Marxism. Well, hold on. You're right. But in the 1950s, it wasn't affecting us much. It wasn't here in the United States. It was spreading around the globe, though. It moved to South America in the 1950s. However, the South Americans, unlike the Chinese and the Russians and the Eastern Bloc countries, weren't ready to give up their religion. South Americans are staunchly Catholic and are not going to allow that to be taken. So what the Marxists did in South America is they involved themselves with the Catholic Church and allowed the Catholic Church to be their moral spokesman and convinced the population that Marxism was morally correct, because the have-nots, God is always for the have-nots. I'm not espousing this. I'm telling you what they believe. God is always for the have-nots. Look at Moses and the children of Israel. Look at all the stories of Jesus, of the rich man that came and said, what do I need to do to have eternal life? What did Jesus say? Give all that you have to the poor. See, God has always been. So the church got involved, not your church, not the United States yet. The church in South America, primarily, jumped on board with that and began to propagate the idea that the church was the moral spokesman for the Marxist governments that were trying to get set up to convince the people that that was morally, religiously, the direction that they should go. It became known as liberation theology. On your little outline, I should have page marked these. I'm sorry I didn't page mark these. We're 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. There's a bright picture of a book up there on the right-hand corner. The definition of liberation theology says this: a religious movement, especially among Roman Catholic clergy in Latin America, that combines political philosophy, usually of Marxist orientation, and a theology of salvation as liberation from injustice. So the gospel message of liberation theology is that God is in favor of the downtrodden. God is the God of the politically, religiously, financially oppressed, and it is the church's job to liberate people and to convince the society as a whole that liberation must happen, which means give from the pot to the pots that are empty. You have a moral obligation to do so, a religious obligation. That's liberation theology. Human rights then became extended to fair wages, health care, gender equality, housing, food, and even the issues of gender identity became wrapped all up in this, because those are the downtrodden peoples. Women are downtrodden. They must be elevated. How do we elevate? We gather the pools and we give that direction. The refugees are the downtrodden. The people of color are the downtrodden. The people who are in the have-not pool must be liberated from that. Well, women are according to them, women are a minority, downcast, oppressed group. They are one of the great oppressed groups of the world. Even though they are the majority, they are seen as a oppressed minority. Just second class. Yeah. That's what they believe. I'm not telling you I agree with this in any way. I'm just telling you where this came from. Okay? So then you wonder, okay, so how did we get this movement started in the United States? It started in the black community with what now has been, that same theological idea was brought into the United States, and it is known. I'm not making it up. Google it. You'll find all kinds of literature, all kinds of organizations that are behind it called Black Liberation Theology, because in the United States, they believe that the greatest oppressed, downtrodden, and shackled group is the black community, and that's the one that has to be liberated. And so that's all getting swept up into what's the one thing that's even more, not bizarre, this group has tried to be as broad-based as they can because they need to pool in as many subgroups as they can, because the more people, the more power that they can generate. And so not only then have they now brought in black liberation theology and the much of the liberal black church, they've even brought in the what do we kind of call it? Where the whole global warming, the globe is in trouble. What are we calling that now? The whole earth first, earth worship, the climate change movement, all of that has been also swept up into that. And that's you don't believe, it's like, how did that get swept up in this group? Well, listen to the quote from the Social Ecology, Economics, and the New Testament. They're sucking this into biblical ideas. Our planet Earth is going through an unprecedented crisis. What do they need? They always need a crisis that allows them to grab a hold of power. The current ecological predicament, is such that the potential to annihilate life as we know it today. It is the global phenomenon that concerns every human being and even the whole creation itself. The international community and many organizations have issued persistent calls to change habits and behaviors, as well as basic organizational patterns of societies to make this world sustainable for future generations. This idea of we're going to have to dismantle the societies, that fits right into Marxism, because Marxism is dismantle the society, dismantle because you can't change it, you have to have a revolution against it. Oh, well, we've already established that. We already established that. That's gone. That's off the table. No. That's why we started that last week, because that had to crumble. Evolution had to help with that, because we had to have an alternative story as how we got here. And once the alternative story as to how we got here arrived, then we could say goodbye to God. And Nietzsche said, pardon me? Because in the South America and in the United States, we're not ready to go atheistic. We're still a religious, spiritual people. Yes. To play to our spirituality. No, not yet. No, not yet. They don't. But we'll get there. But many do. Many do. So liberation theology has gotten a big stronghold. We're going to look at a video in just a minute. And so then what ended up happening is liberation theology was almost completely controlled by black men. And so what has happened is the fairly recent development of what you hear on the news every day called Black Lives Matter. And what you're going to see, what you're getting handed is what I took off of Black Lives Matter official website. I'm not making this up. I'm not giving you anything that they have not proudly proclaimed. The first thing I want you to notice is on the very first page that I have underlined is if there is any communication that comes against Black Lives Matters and is against their policies and against their belief systems, their encouragement is for the people to rat us out. To make sure that Black Lives Matters knows who is dissenting against the mantra of the movement. And they put that on the first page of their website. If you know anybody speaking against us, let us know, because we're going to go after them. And we have congressmen and we have other religious leaders and political leaders being targeted by this organization. You say, is this, well, don't we all believe Black Lives Matter? Absolutely we do. However, that's not, do you have an extra copy?
White, yellow, and red, and brown.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So if you look on the back of page 1, you'll see a little bit of her story, not his story, not the history of the company, because we are going to do everything we can to take males out of this picture. Notice I've underlined for you underneath the 3 women who started the organization this paragraph. As organizers, we work with everyday people. Black Lives Matter members see and understand significant gaps in movement space in leadership. Black liberation, there's our group, the Black Liberation Movement, wasn't broad enough for them, primarily because it was made up of men, heterosexual men. And that was not a big enough umbrella for them. And so because that wasn't big enough, they have come along and made a space for leadership for mostly black. It was made up of heterosexual cisgender men, leaving women, queer, and transgender people and others either out of the movement or in the background to move the work forward with little or no negotiation. Recognition. I don't have my glasses on, and this print is not. The Black Lives Matter movement has almost nothing to do with literally the preservation of black lives. It has nothing to do with that.
Cisgender is when you're born a gender and you agree with it.
Right. So hopefully all of you are cisgender. You're a woman and you agree that you're a woman and you plan to stay a woman. That's a cisgender. So this movement is mainly developed to help involve to have a huge impact upon the gender movement. Notice the next paragraph down, some important terminology. They are here to really involve themselves in state-sanctioned violence. They were experiencing that. The black community has experienced state-sanctioned violence. You'll hear that a lot because this is no longer one man in one town who violated the human rights of another man and should be prosecuted for that. This is now a group issue. We as a group have sanctioned violence against another group, and we need to be held responsible to that. It's moved into the church where even yesterday an entire prayer meeting was held between blacks and whites in the United States of America, in which all the blacks in the prayer meeting stood on the stage while all the whites in the audience bowed on knees and asked forgiveness to the blacks that were on the stage. And it was an ecumenical prayer meeting that was held yesterday. because it's the white as a group that is responsible for the demise and the oppression of these minority groups. Pardon me? I didn't read that far. I couldn't hardly stomach the... Yes. Yeah. You'll see a whole paragraph there on what they believe, and what you'll see is that what they believe and what they're pursuing has almost nothing to do with literally preserving, protecting, coming to the aid of, or abetting in any way the help of black lives. That's not what it is all about. You can read what they believe. I want to give some time for some comment after this really great video. David, are you ready back there? Let's show that video.
Justice, as we continue to try to understand its meaning. The mission of social justice really happens in stages. We've heard about some of it. Number one, identifying disadvantaged groups. And it's important to understand that social justice is not about the individual, it's about the group. And this is why, I mean, you can say as much as you want about an individual having success. But the issue is not individuals who have success or whether individuals can have success. Hooray, there was a bi-ethnic man who was the president, right? But again, that does not negate the issues inherent to the group as a whole. And so the mission of social justice first is to identify disadvantaged groups. And I say groups and not minorities. Often we talk about disadvantaged minorities, but that is not the case. And you need only one example to prove that that's not the case, and that example is women. Women are more than 50% of the population. They are a majority. However, women are considered, for the sake of social justice, a disadvantaged minority. Hey man, I don't write the rules, y'all, okay? There's more of them than there are of us, but they are a minority. So the identification of disadvantaged groups. This is incredibly important. This is why we do politics the way that we do. In politics, we don't want to know if this candidate is ahead in the polls. That's not enough. We want to know that this guy is doing really well with red-headed, left-handed white females, and this guy over here is really doing well with blue-collar, Ford truck driving. I mean, we want to know which groups they are representing, because politics now is identity politics. And we want to know what you will do for our group, not necessarily who you are, what you believe, but what you will do for our group. So identify disadvantaged groups. Secondly, assess group outcomes. Again, this is not about individual outcomes, this is about group outcomes. We have to assess group outcomes. Thirdly, assign blame for disparate outcomes. Assign blame for disparate outcomes. If this group is having a negative outcome in this particular area, then we need to find out who's to blame for that. If this group doesn't do as well academically, if this group doesn't do as well economically, if this group is not as well represented politically, and then finally, there needs to be a redistribution of power and resources in order to redress those grievances. That's the answer. And that has to be the answer according to social justice. So you may say, well, wait a minute, this group may be disadvantaged in this area because of something within that group. That's victim blaming. Yeah, but there could be statistical reason. I don't want to hear about your statistics. You're blaming the victim. The answer is a redress of grievances. That's the ideology of social justice. Listen to this from John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, really a seminal work on the topic. He writes, since the principle for an individual is to advance as far as possible his own welfare, the principle for society is to advance as far as possible the welfare of the group. Social justice is the principle of rational prudence applied to an aggregative conception of the welfare of the group. The welfare of the group. Another author puts it this way: as I see it, social justice requires resource equity, fairness, and respect for diversity, as well as the eradication of existing forms of social oppression. Social justice entails a redistribution of resources from those who have unjustly gained them. And by the way, all of those who have them are assumed to have unjustly gained them unless they are a member of an aggrieved minority group. So if you're a white person who has acquired wealth, that's unjust. It's unjust. Black people dominate the shortest and the longest race in the Olympics. Justice. Make up the majority of the NBA and the NFL. Justice. Do you see? The idea here is if the disparity accrues to the benefit of a group that is identified as an oppressed minority, then the disparity is not to be looked at. Social justice entails a redistribution of resources from those who have unjustly gained them to those who justly deserve them. And it also means creating and ensuring the processes of truly democratic participation in decision-making. It seems clear that only a decisive redistribution of resources and decision-making power can ensure social justice and authentic democracy. Redistribution. That's the goal. Redistribution of both resources and of power. Redistribution from those who have gained them unjustly to those who actually deserve them. And here's what's interesting. We're talking about groups. So what that means is we're not saying that you were unjust. I mean, you could have worked hard. In fact, you could have come from nothing, from less than nothing, pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps, worked from the bottom of the ladder all the way to the top. You can be a self-made man. But if you're a self-made man, the determination of whether you have it justly or unjustly has nothing to do with how you got there and has everything to do with what group you belong to. So you can be a white person from Appalachia who was born with nothing and clawed yourself out. It doesn't matter. You are the privileged one. And if you stand shoulder to shoulder with the son or daughter of Colin Powell, who grew up with privilege and power, the answer is whatever they have, they deserve. And whatever you have, you did not. Because social justice examines the group. It looks at the group level. The mission of social justice then addresses myriad issues, but let me just give you one example. There's a group called Faithful America. On their website, they identify themselves as the largest, fastest growing online community of Christians putting faith into practice for social justice. So again, they're using the word. They understand what the word means. By the way, if you just look at the Oxford Dictionary of the English language, they agree. Social justice is distributive justice. So there is complete agreement in the academic world, there's complete agreement in the political world, there's complete agreement in society at large as to what we mean when we use the word social justice. Faithful America has on their page some of their victories and exploits in fighting for justice. Again, largest online Christian group fighting for social justice. What have they accomplished? Well, they fought back against Hobby Lobby. That's number one on their list. They fought back against Hobby Lobby. Why did they need to fight back against Hobby Lobby? Because Hobby Lobby was fighting for the oppression of minorities who are not minorities. Okay. Convinced Google to drop World Vision. Convinced Google to drop World Vision. 3, forced MSNBC to drop the Family Research Council. Are you seeing a pattern here? 4, helped students win justice for a fired principal. The fired principal was a sodomite. Openly gay man. They went to war and won justice for this individual. Defended an unjustly defrocked pastor. Who's the unjustly defrocked pastor? Well, he's a Methodist pastor who, against the orders of his denomination, performed a same-sex wedding for his son and his son's partner. And that it was unjust for him to be fired. Now remember, folks, injustice equals sin. It is a sin not to perform same-sex unions. This is their argument. And then the last one, and I love that they just have this tacked on, fought the fracking industry. Justice! Now, if you think that those don't make any sense, then you don't understand the social justice movement. Let me explain this for you. There are 3 main areas encompassing the social justice movement. 3 main areas. There are others for sure, and we'll talk about some of those, but there are 3 main areas. The first is minority equality, writ large. Minority equality, okay? The second one is feminism and women's rights. And the third one is LGBTQA+ rights. Minority equality, when they talk about minority equality, this idea that we've already talked about, success and wealth are a result of illegitimate privilege unless that success and wealth has been accrued by someone who does not belong to the illegitimately privileged class. So, for example, Asians are a minority, right? Asians are a minority. However, on college entrance, college admission, they're whooping everybody. Not everybody, they're whooping everybody. That's beyond everybody, right? Economically, they surpass whites. But again, not an issue. Why? Because inequality equals injustice unless it accrues to the benefit of a minority. Or let's say not a minority, but to an oppressed group. Because remember, women are majority, but they are given minority status. Feminism and women's rights. Again, this is another one. It is always part of the argument. This is the heart of the social justice movement. The feminist movement is there. You cannot, and I believe it's naive for those who want to say, on the one hand, well, no, we don't want to promote feminism and we don't want to promote LGBTQA plus rights and all this other stuff. Really, we just want, and we don't even want in on all of the so-called minority equality movement. It's just racial equality, and even specifically there, just black people and white people. That's like putting hot water in the front of your bathtub and saying you don't want the back to heat up. You can't get away from it. And then the third one, LGBTQA plus rights. And by the way, I'm not being funny when I say LGBTQA plus. L, lesbian, B, bisexual, G, gay, T, transgender, Q, queer or questioning, and A is for allies. LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, and their allies. And then plus, because we don't want to offend anybody because they haven't been included as part of the acronym. There was a book called After the Ball. You may have even heard me speak about this book. After the Ball, the subtitle is How America Will Overcome Its Fear and Hatred of Gays in the Decade of the 90s. It was written by two Harvard professors, Russell Kirk and Hunter Mattson, one a professor in psychology, the other a professor in marketing. And their book, in their own words, was a propaganda strategy. Their propaganda strategy had three phases. Phase number one, desensitizing. Phase number two, jamming. And phase number three, conversion. These are also the phases of brainwashing, and they acknowledge this in their book. Desensitizing. What do we do in the desensitizing? Well, you get straight people used to seeing gays, gay people, gay relationships, gay sex, get them used to seeing it. And Kirk and Mattson in the book say, this is the analogy that they use, right? They may have an aversion initially to taking this shower, but eventually they'll get used to being wet. Just bombard them through the media, bombard them through television, bombard them through movies, bombard them through the educational system to where it's just normalized. And here's what's interesting. We've lived in Zambia now for the last 3.5 years, and I come back 3-4 times a year. The family is here. We're on a 2-month furlough. And I've been getting my football fix, the playoffs are going on, and I've been getting some other stuff like that we just, don't even, when I was here, maybe not. Now that I can't do it, man, I need it. So anyway, I'm watching and I'm noticing a number of things. I'm noticing that there are a couple of commercials that I'm seeing, a couple of companies that are running commercials. And I keep seeing these commercials over and over again. One of them is a company that is promoting the sale of jewelry, right? And for special occasions. And there's vignettes of various couples. And in every one of their commercials, there's at least one vignette of a same-sex couple. And again, a lot of the people that I talk to, they go, oh yeah. Why? Because we're desensitized. I mean, it's just there all the time. I've noticed in virtually every football game that I've seen, college football game or a professional football game, there's commercials, and there's always at least one of the commercials that includes a female football player. Huh? When did this? Social justice. Social justice. Minority equality, feminism, women's rights, and LGBTQ plus rights. And now we've sort of moved beyond. You know, there's the desensitizing, then there's the jamming. And the jamming, what they do is they say they want to reduce the so-called psychic rewards. They want to, you know, identify the idea of being against same-sex marriage with the idea of being a skinhead or a neo-Nazi or whatever. You know. Some of you are still offended because I used the word sodomite earlier. I did that intentionally because I was going to talk about being desensitized and being jammed. The reason that you felt uncomfortable with me using that word is because you've been jammed. It's a word the Bible uses. Amen. The word homosexual, very recent invention. The word gay, up until, just within a single lifetime, you've seen gay going from meaning happy and, right? Queer, the word queer. Anybody read The Secret Garden? Right? The Secret Garden is it's the book that we read, Secret Garden, right? We were listening to The Secret Garden during one of our trips, and I did several, like half a dozen times. The word queer is used. It means, it used to mean, somebody is a little strange. We've been desensitized, we've been jammed, and then there's conversion. Conversion is when people become allies. Become allies. How do you make people allies to the LGBTQA plus community? Kirk and Mattson? By identifying gays and gay people as aggrieved minorities and hitching their wagon to the civil rights / social justice movement so that the idea of being anti-gay is equivalent to the idea of being a member of the KKK. What about other issues? Because there are other issues. One, environmentalism, climate change is a social justice issue. And according to most people, it is the #1 social justice issue. Because, I don't know if you realize this or not, climate change primarily affects minorities. Don't ask me to explain, I'm just telling you. Income inequality, global inequality. So you've heard about white privilege, right? But the same article basically puts American privilege on par with white privilege. So here it's white privilege. Globally, it's American privilege. So think about social justice in the American context, and then back up and look at the entire world. And America is the rich bad guy who has unjustly acquired his wealth, who needs to be brought to heel and have that wealth redistributed to the rest of the world. How are you going to do that? Go back to #1, climate change. How are we going to deal with climate change? Well, easy. You guys pay. Immigration, universal health care, animal rights, veganism and vegetarianism, and access to abortion. I want us to look at 2 of these, because some of y'all are like, veganism and vegetarianism? Yes. If I could show you, I'd show you this website. Black veganism rooted in social justice. What does black veganism have to do with social justice? Well, the article goes on to say, for a lot of black people, it's the link between social justice and food access. Veganism gives black youth personal autonomy. We take back control of our own diet in a system in which we are not in control of many of the things that we purchase. How about the issue of abortion or access to abortion? Women on the Web has an article, Abortion, a Matter of Human Rights and Social Justice. You see, here's the great irony, because there are a lot of people who would argue that abortion is absolutely a justice issue. The murder of the unborn is a justice issue. Amen? And ironically, the murder of the unborn disproportionately affects the unborn who, if they were born, would look like me. It's a justice issue, right? But within the social justice movement, it is access to abortion that's the social justice issue. Do you see that? Got less than 2 minutes left. 3 issues here. As far as this terminology goes, there's 3 things we need to think about. Number 1, clarity. Does using the terminology of social justice give us the greatest clarity? I say absolutely not. Because whenever we want to argue that social justice is a gospel issue, the first thing we have to do is move away from the definition of social justice that everybody already knows. We have to define it in a way that the Oxford Dictionary of the English language doesn't define it. We have to define it in a way that schools of sociology and social justice, yes, Stanford, University of Texas, University of Chicago, a number of schools are offering degrees in sociology and social justice. And the way we define it in order to say this is a gospel issue looks nothing like the way it's being defined in the culture at large. So no, we lose on the clarity issue. The second one is toxicity. I believe it's toxic. It's toxic terminology when you see some of the groups that are using this terminology, who are identified with this terminology. It's toxic. Thirdly, necessity. Is it necessary for us to use social justice terminology in order to get at the issues that we're trying to get at? I don't think it is. There are alternatives, and we need to use those alternatives. Finally, the use of this terminology has a chilling effect. First of all, it begs the question. Literally, I don't mean it raises the question. A lot of people use begs the question when they mean raises the question. That's a whole nother issue of using wrong terminology. But I mean begging the question in terms of debate, right? Arguing facts that are not in evidence. It begs the question. If I say something is a social justice issue, if you and I are having a disagreement and I declare that it's a social justice issue, I've already declared that my position is the high ground. And it confers omniscience upon the person using the terminology, because there could be myriad factors that would explain an inequity. And when I say that is a social justice issue, I'm assuming that I understand all of those factors. And then finally, it shuts down debate, argument, discussion. Because see, God demands justice. The minute I say this is a justice issue, I've just said to you that if you're not on the side of it that I'm arguing, you're in sin. And so it has a chilling effect. We got people scared to talk to each other. All because of this terminology that is really well established, clearly understood. Why go through the gymnastics necessary in order to use the terminology. I believe it's because, unfortunately, we're trying to satisfy the very people from whom the terminology comes. And that's a fight worth fighting.
Guy, Vodi Bachman. He's on the YouTube. He's got all kinds of videos out there.
Yes,
Great stuff.
One on racial reconciliation.
Yeah, good stuff. Why did I show that? Was to help you understand that the terminology has been changed on us. And when we're talking about issues, that's not what the definitions we have in our mind of what justice is and what they're talking about are completely different things. And therefore, we are scratching our head as to why are they doing these things? Why is this behavior? This seems unimaginable. We can't even wrap our minds around it. It's because they have a whole different way of defining what social justice is and how you go about obtaining it. Because therefore it explains looting. It explains demolishing of the police departments. It involves, the destruction of others' property for your benefit. I mean, because Marxism is taking what has been unjustly given to the people who have it and redistributing it. In the United States now, that's morally acceptable. How? Because the church got involved. They got in bed with the church. And therefore, it has a moral undertone to it. And what has happened in the evangelical church is we have taken steps that direction because we've been guilted into feeling like if we don't, then we are racists, unjust, sinful people, because our number one goal isn't to get in lockstep with this movement. And so when you hear these things and you scratch your head, you're having, pardon me? Oh, no. I'm just, this evening what I want to do is help you understand that the reason it seems so confusing is because we're using the same words, but we have totally different definitions. I mean, it would be like if I took you back 240 years ago and you were in the Continental Congress and you said, we don't want taxation without representation. You know what the King of England and the English thought? That's ridiculous. You have representation. You have a king. He's the most qualified representative because he's God's man on earth. You have representation. You have a king. And we said, absolutely not. We don't want a king. As a matter of fact, there's an inherent problem with a royal family being in rule of us. We're going to even tell you to dismantle your military, or we will fight you to send them back to England, and we will take over this country. The revolution used similar. I'm not saying one was just, one was unjust. I'm just telling you what the English thought and how the King of England perceived this. They probably scratched their heads going, what are you talking about? Give me liberty or give me death. You have plenty of liberty. I'm thousands of miles from you, and I've given you my representatives. And how can you expect representation? I am your representative, given to you by God of all people. And now you want to throw me out and dismantle my police? That's what we did. That's revolutionary because it's a different mentality. You're defining words differently. Bring yourself 240 years later. You've got a group of people that are becoming the majority of the youth are defining terminology differently, and it makes us scratch our head. It's because they have a whole different agenda. It is not justice as we would define it. It's not lives matter. If Black Lives Matter, they would fight tooth and nail to end abortion, because far more Black babies are aborted by the millions than white babies. This has nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. It's an agenda to overthrow, to dismantle have you heard the terminology on the TV? The systemic problem. It's not like you can get rid of one cop. You've got to dismantle the entire police department. You can't just vote one. You can't vote any longer. You have to revolt. It's the same, justified or unjustified. It's what we did to England 240 years ago. We couldn't put up with the king. It's not about voting in a new king. It's getting rid of the king. That's where we are now. Come back next week. Thank you. That was perfect. I should have paid you for that. I'll give you a check as you leave. I'll give you a little check. That was perfect. Because we do need to know now. Okay, so now what? We've went down this trail. We can track the dominoes being put in place. We believe, as I believe, those dominoes have been masterfully put in place by the enemy in order to bring to heel the American experiment. Because once the American experiment is buckled, the whole world will now become the socialist-dominated world that is necessary for the coming of the Antichrist. You have to have a socialist world to have a one-world currency, a one-world religion, a one-world language, and a one-world seat of power. And one of the last bastions preventing that from happening is the Holy Spirit, who is the restrainer of this wickedness, and the United States experiment. The United States experiment is under siege, and it leads me to believe that soon the restrainer, along with Jesus' church, will be taken to glory so that God's plan for the ages can come about. What are we going to do in the meantime? See you next Wednesday. Okay, let me pray. Father, we just thank you for our time together. And God, we do pray for our nation, this land that we do love, this place where we have grown and raised our families, and seen your blessings and your riches outpoured to us. And God, we also count it of great value to have a church that has freedom to speak freely and to proclaim the truth from the pulpits around the nation, and we would pray that would continue. We would enjoy these freedoms for many, many generations to come. But God, as we see those things being eroded, give us courage to live this Christian life and to follow and to understand the mission that you have given us here on this earth. Be with us now as we leave. Keep us safe and keep us close to you in our walk with you this week until we can be together again. We ask your blessing and guidance in Jesus' name. Amen.